Imagine dedicating over a decade of your life to a company, sacrificing family time, pouring your heart into every project, and never missing a day. Then one morning, just one, fate throws you a curveball. You're late, and within minutes, your entire career shatters because of a ruthless manager who couldn't care less. But what if the one decision that broke you also caught the attention of the person you'd never expect? Someone who knows your struggle all too well and has the power to turn everything around. What happens next will restore your faith in justice and in the kindness of a stranger. Let me tell you the story of John, a man who learned that sometimes losing everything can be the beginning of something far greater, if the right person is watching. John was the kind of employee every company dreams of having. For over a decade, he was the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave. His colleagues often joked that the company would collapse if John ever took a day off. He wasn't just punctual, he was the backbone of his team, holding everything together with unwavering dedication and a smile that could light up even the darkest of days. But what most people didn't know was that John's devotion to his job wasn't just about building a career, it was about survival. As a single father, every paycheck was a lifeline. Every overtime hour meant a little more security for his daughter, Emma, a spirited 8-year-old with curly hair and a love for drawing. John would often look at her asleep before heading to work, a gentle reminder of why he pushed himself so hard. He wasn't just working to build a life for himself, he was building a future for her. John's journey hadn't been an easy one. His wife, Lisa, had passed away in a tragic car accident when Emma was just 2. The grief had almost destroyed him, but he pulled himself together for the sake of his daughter. That meant working tirelessly, sacrificing his own needs, and sometimes even his health, just to make sure Emma never felt the void left by her mother's absence. He wanted to be both a father and a mother to her, even if it meant running himself ragged. Everyone in the company knew John's story. They knew how he would rush home during his lunch breaks to check on Emma, making sure she had everything she needed. They saw him decline countless offers to go out after work, choosing instead to spend time with his little girl. Yet despite his personal struggles, John never brought his problems to work. He was always professional, always positive. No matter how exhausted he was, he greeted everyone with the same warm smile. The sacrifices he made didn't go unnoticed by his peers. They respected him, admired him even. But admiration doesn't pay the bills. And so John kept pushing, one day after another, always showing up, always giving his best, never complaining. He believed that if he kept his head down and worked hard enough, someday all the sacrifices would pay off. Someday he would get that promotion he'd been hoping for, and Emma would have the life she deserved. But life has a funny way of testing even the most resilient souls. One winter morning, after a long night of Emma coughing and shivering with a fever that refused to break, John knew he had to take her to the hospital. He sat beside her bed, watching the tiny beads of sweat on her forehead, his heart aching. He hadn't planned on being late that day. He never did. But Emma's health came first. He quickly dressed her, bundled her up, and drove through the snow-covered streets to the nearest clinic. Sitting in the waiting room, he kept glancing at the clock, anxiety gnawing at him. He knew he should call in, let them know he'd be late, but his phone was dead from being on call with the doctor all night. He whispered words of comfort to Emma, trying to keep his panic at bay. Every second ticked by like a hammer on his chest. Being late was unthinkable for someone like John, who had built his entire career on reliability. But as he looked into his daughter's tired eyes, he knew he had no choice. By the time Emma was seen and diagnosed with a severe flu, it was already past 9 a.m. His shift started at 8. John's stomach twisted with worry, but he pushed it aside, focusing on Emma's well-being. The doctor prescribed medication and advised rest. John's heart pounded as he thanked the doctor, scooped Emma up, and rushed her back home. He set her up on the couch with her favorite blanket, made her some soup, and kissed her forehead. "Daddy will be back soon, sweetheart. Just rest, okay?" he whispered softly, trying to hide the worry in his voice. Emma nodded weakly, trusting her father as she always did. John sped through the streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He kept replaying the same thought over and over. What if they don't understand? What if I lose my job? His heart sank as he imagined Emma's disappointed face if he couldn't provide for her. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they'd been through. When he finally burst through the office doors at 10 a.m., 2 hours late, he was out of breath, his face flushed from the cold and the stress. He looked around nervously, hoping to slip in unnoticed. But the moment he stepped in, a silence fell over the office. All eyes turned to him, and standing at the center of it all, with a look of sheer disdain on his face, was the new boss, Mr. Carter. John had heard about Mr. Carter. He was the kind of manager who believed in strict rules and zero tolerance for anything that even remotely resembled weakness. Freshly transferred from another branch, he had no connections with the team, no understanding of their struggles, and certainly no compassion for people like John. Mr. Carter's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Well, well, well. Look who decided to grace us with his presence today," he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. 2 hours late and not even a phone call? John opened his mouth to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. His co-workers exchanged nervous glances, whispering softly among themselves. They knew John's story. They knew he wasn't the type to show up late without a good reason. But Mr. Carter didn't care about reasons. "I'm sorry, sir. I had an emergency with my daughter," John began, his voice strained, but Mr. Carter cut him off sharply. "An emergency?" he scoffed. "You think that's an excuse? We run a business here, not a daycare." The words stung, and John's face flushed with a mix of shame and anger. But he bit his tongue, forcing himself to stay calm. "I understand, sir. It won't happen again," John said quietly, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to say more, to defend himself, but one look at Mr. Carter's icy expression told him it would be pointless. "Of course it won't," Mr. Carter replied coldly, "because as of now, you're no longer needed here. You're fired." The room went still. John blinked, struggling to process the words. Fired? For being late once? After 10 years of perfect attendance? It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. He looked around, searching the faces of his co-workers for support, for someone to speak up, but no one moved. No one dared defy the new boss. John took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. His daughter needed him. If he lost control now, he'd lose everything. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he nodded slowly. I understand," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. But deep down, a storm of emotions raged. Anger, hurt, and a devastating sense of betrayal. After everything he'd given, after all the sacrifices he'd made, he was being thrown away. Just like that. And as he stood there, his world crumbling around him, John couldn't shake one thought. What would happen to Emma now? John could barely hear his own footsteps over the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The walk from the office entrance to his desk seemed endless, every step weighed down by the stares of his coworkers. He could feel the eyes on him, the confusion, the curiosity, and the underlying fear that seemed to ripple through the room. But he kept his gaze forward, trying to appear calm, trying to remind himself that he'd done nothing wrong. Just one day. Just one time. He had been late only once in over 10 years. Surely that had to count for something. But deep down, he knew better. The moment he saw Mr. Carter's cold, calculating gaze lock onto him, he knew there would be no forgiveness, no understanding. People like Mr. Carter thrived on control and power. To them, an employee's dedication meant nothing if it couldn't be used as leverage. And today, John was the perfect example to make a statement. An example of what happens when you break the rules, even once. "John!" Mr. Carter's voice boomed through the office, sharp and unforgiving. It carried with it a sense of finality, as if he had already made up his mind about John's fate long before he even arrived. Heads turned as the room fell into a tense silence, the sound of keyboards and murmurs disappearing in an instant. John froze mid-step, his fingers tightening around the strap of his worn-out briefcase. He forced himself to look up, meeting Mr. Carter's eyes, and for a fleeting moment he saw something there. A glimmer of satisfaction, a cruel enjoyment in watching someone squirm. "Yes, sir," John replied, his voice steady but low, betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. "Do you realize what time it is?" Mr. Carter asked, though it was clearly a rhetorical question. The smirk playing on his lips told John that he wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for submission, for remorse. He was looking for John to break. I do, sir. I'm so sorry. My daughter was... Your daughter? Mr. Carter interrupted, raising an eyebrow. He leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk as if preparing to deliver a final blow. Let me get this straight. You were late because of a personal issue? You couldn't even pick up the phone to inform us? My phone was... John tried to explain, but his words were cut off yet again. Excuses, Mr. Carter spat, his tone dripping with disdain. This isn't a charity, John. We don't pay you to handle your personal problems on company time. We pay you to be here, on time, every day, no matter what. John felt his chest tighten. He knew it was pointless to argue, but he had to try. I've never been late before, sir. Not once in 10 years. I promise it won't happen again. My daughter was sick, and I... Enough! Mr. Carter's voice rose, cutting through John's pleas like a blade. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the room, ensuring that everyone was watching, everyone was listening. I don't care if it was once or 100 times. The fact is, you weren't here when we needed you. And as far as I'm concerned, that makes you unreliable. Unreliable, the word echoed in John's mind, twisting like a knife. After everything he'd done, after all the sacrifices, the late nights, the missed weekends with Emma, this was what he got. This was how they saw him, as a liability. Sir, please, John whispered, his pride crumbling under the weight of the humiliation. He could feel the burn of tears threatening to spill, but he blinked them back furiously. He would not cry, not here, not in front of everyone. I need this job. My daughter... Your daughter, Mr. Carter repeated mockingly, his voice loud enough to make the nearest employees flinch. He took a step closer, towering over John. Let me make this clear. Whatever problems you have at home are your own. They don't concern me, and they don't concern this company. What concerns me is your lack of professionalism. John bit the inside of his cheek so hard he tasted blood. He could feel the gazes of his coworkers, some sympathetic, some frightened, and others just curious. But no one moved. No one spoke up. They were all just waiting, watching him crumble. I'm sorry, sir, John said softly, lowering his head. He didn't know what else to say. He felt like he was shrinking under the weight of Mr. Carter's gaze, every word cutting deeper, stripping away the last shreds of his dignity. I truly am. Just, please, give me another chance. The silence that followed felt like a lifetime, and then slowly, a cruel smile spread across Mr. Carter's face. Oh, John, he sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. You know what the problem with people like you is? You think loyalty and hard work will protect you. But here's a reality check. In this world, one mistake is all it takes to erase a lifetime of effort. You're fired. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. John stood frozen, his mind blank, unable to process what he just heard. Fired? It couldn't be. Not like this. Not for something so insignificant. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, his heart pounding so violently it hurt. For a moment he couldn't breathe, and then, as if on autopilot, he turned away, his legs moving mechanically toward his desk. He felt like he was in a nightmare, his movements sluggish, the world around him hazy. He barely noticed the stunned expressions of his colleagues, the hushed whispers that followed him as he made his way to his corner cubicle. His hands trembled as he reached for his things, his framed photo of Emma, his neatly stacked files, his awards and certificates that suddenly felt meaningless. As he packed, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Fired, just like that. No warning, no discussion. One slip-up, one bad day, and everything he'd worked for, everything he'd given up for, was gone. His fingers brushed over Emma's photo, her innocent smile staring back at him. He thought of her waiting at home, wrapped up in her favorite blanket, trusting that her father would return with good news, that everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay at all. John, a soft voice whispered behind him. He turned to see Sarah, one of his oldest co-workers, standing there, her face pale with shock. I'm so sorry. This isn't fair. Everyone knows you're the most dedicated. Please, John murmured, shaking his head. Don't. There's nothing you can say. Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes, but she stepped back, biting her lip as if to hold back the words she so desperately wanted to say. John finished packing, his movements stiff and robotic. He could feel the stares, the pity, the disbelief. But what hurt the most was the silence of people who he'd considered friends, the people he'd helped countless times, the people who now just stood there, letting this happen. With his box of belongings in hand, he walked slowly toward the exit, his heart heavy. He kept his head high, refusing to give Mr. Carter the satisfaction of seeing him broken. But inside he was crumbling. As he reached the door, he paused, turning back one last time. Mr. Carter was watching him, a smug smile playing on his lips. John wanted to say something, to shout, to demand answers. But what good would it do? So he swallowed the bitter words, nodded stiffly, and stepped out into the cold, harsh world outside. And as the door closed behind him, it felt like a chapter of his life had just been slammed shut forever. But this was just the beginning, because sometimes when one door closes, another one you never expected, opens wide. And John had no idea that someone far more powerful than Mr. Carter had just taken notice of what happened and was about to change everything. John stood outside the building, the icy wind cutting through his thin coat as he stared blankly at the bustling street. Cars rushed by, people hurried past, and the city carried on like nothing had changed. But for John, everything had. His world, his sense of security, the stability he'd fought so hard to maintain, all of it shattered in a matter of minutes. He glanced down at the cardboard box in his arms, filled with remnants of his decade-long career. The framed picture of Emma looked almost out of place amid the cold gray concrete of the sidewalk. Her smile, so bright and innocent, felt like a cruel reminder of everything he'd just lost. He could still see the smug satisfaction on Mr. Carter's face, the way he'd watched John leave, as if savoring every second of his defeat. What was he supposed to do now? Go home and tell his little girl that her daddy, the man she always looked up to, had been fired? That he'd failed her? His thoughts swirled, dark and suffocating, but John forced himself to take a deep breath. No, he couldn't think like that. Emma needed him. This wasn't about him. It was about her. He had to be strong, even if everything inside him was falling apart. He adjusted the box under his arm, squared his shoulders, and started the long walk home. The cold bit at his cheeks as he trudged through the snow-covered streets, each step heavier than the last. He tried to ignore the stares from passers-by, the sympathetic glances that seemed to say, "There goes another man beaten down by life." But John didn't want sympathy. He didn't want pity. All he wanted was a chance to prove himself, to show that this one mistake didn't define him. The memory of Mr. Carter's harsh words echoed in his mind. One mistake is all it takes to erase a lifetime of effort. How could 10 years of loyalty be wiped away so easily? How could everything he'd worked for be dismissed like it was nothing? But the world didn't care about loyalty. It didn't care about sacrifices. It cared about power, about control. And Mr. Carter had made it clear who held the power today. As he reached the small two-bedroom apartment he shared with Emma, John hesitated outside the door. His hand trembled as he fished out his keys, his heart hammering in his chest. How was he supposed to face her? How was he supposed to tell her that the man she believed could do anything had just been humiliated and thrown out like garbage? Taking a deep breath, John pushed the door open, stepping into the warm, comforting glow of their home. The smell of vanilla candles greeted him, and he could hear Emma humming softly in the living room. She looked up as he entered, her big brown eyes lighting up with joy. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, jumping up from the couch and running over to him. "You're home early. Does that mean we get to spend more time together?" John's throat tightened, the sight of her so full of hope and excitement breaking his heart all over again. He set the box down carefully, kneeling to pull her into his arms. She felt so small, so fragile, and he held her tighter than usual, burying his face in her soft curls. "Yeah, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. We'll get to spend a lot more time together. Emma giggled, oblivious to the weight of his words. She pulled back, looking up at him with that same trusting gaze that always made him feel like a hero. Can we go to the park later? And maybe get ice cream? Please, Daddy. John forced a smile, swallowing the lump in his throat. Sure, honey, whatever you want. But as he watched her scamper back to the couch, humming happily to herself, his smile faded. How long could he keep this up? How long until the bills started piling up? Until he couldn't afford ice cream or rent or anything? His mind raced with panic, but he pushed it down, shoving the fear into a corner of his mind where it couldn't touch him. Right now, Emma didn't need to see him scared. She didn't need to know how close they were to losing everything. Daddy, what's in the box? She asked suddenly, peeking over the back of the couch. John blinked, glancing at the box he'd set down by the door. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. How could he explain that this box, this small, pathetic collection of items, was all that was left of his career? It's just some stuff from work, he said quietly, walking over to pick it up. He sifted through the contents, his fingers brushing over the framed photo, the awards he'd once been so proud of. It all seemed so meaningless now. Emma frowned, tilting her head. Why'd you bring it home? Are you going to work from home now? John hesitated, the lie forming on his tongue. He wanted to protect her, to keep that smile on her face just a little longer. But he knew he couldn't hide the truth forever. She deserved to know, at least some of it. I'm not going to work for a little while, sweetheart, he said softly, choosing his words carefully. Daddy's taking a break. A break? Emma repeated, her brow furrowing. But why? John's chest tightened. He took a deep breath, kneeling beside her so he could look her in the eye. Sometimes, he said slowly, things don't go the way we want them to. Even if we try our hardest, sometimes bad things happen. But you know what? Emma shook her head, her eyes wide and curious. John reached out, gently cupping her cheek. We don't give up. We keep trying, no matter what, because as long as we have each other, we'll be okay, right? She blinked, considering his words for a moment, and then slowly she nodded. Right, John smiled, feeling a tiny flicker of warmth in his chest. She believed him. Even when he didn't believe in himself, Emma did. And that meant everything. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and quiet despair. John spent hours every day scouring job listings, sending out resumes, making phone calls, all while putting on a brave face for Emma. He told her stories, made her laugh, and took her to the park as promised, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But it wasn't. His savings were dwindling faster than he'd expected, and with each passing day, the fear grew stronger. The worst part was the silence from his old colleagues. He hadn't heard from a single one of them since he'd been fired. Not a text, not a call, nothing. It was as if he'd been erased from their lives overnight. He couldn't help but wonder if they were afraid to speak up, afraid of what Mr. Carter might do if they showed him any support. But John didn't blame them. He knew how it felt to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone who held your entire livelihood in their hands. And so, he swallowed his bitterness, focusing instead on what mattered, finding a way to support Emma. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him and rejection emails piling up in his inbox, Emma wandered over, clutching a piece of paper. Daddy, look, she said brightly, holding up a drawing. It's you and me at the park. See? John stared at the picture, a crude, colorful sketch of the two of them holding hands, smiling under a bright blue sky. He felt his throat tighten, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. In that moment, all the fear, the frustration, the hopelessness, it all melted away. Because no matter what happened, no matter how many times life knocked him down, he still had Emma. And that was worth more than any job, any paycheck, any career. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and whispered softly, We're going to be okay, sweetheart, I promise. And as she hugged him back, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck, John knew that somehow, some way, he would keep that promise. Because Emma believed in him, and he would never let her down. Not now, not ever. The atmosphere in the office was tense. Ever since John's abrupt dismissal, there had been a palpable change among the employees. Conversations that used to be lively and filled with laughter were now hushed, cautious. Everyone walked on eggshells, careful not to draw Mr. Carter's attention. The man who had once been just another name in the company had quickly become a tyrant, ruling through fear and intimidation. But not everyone was willing to stay silent. One of John's closest colleagues, Sarah, couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at her. Every time she passed by John's empty cubicle, a wave of shame washed over her. She had stood by, frozen, while a good man was torn down for a single mistake. A man who had given everything to the company. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could do something to set things right. After days of sleepless nights and countless drafts of an email she didn't have the courage to send, Sarah finally made a decision. She gathered every ounce of her courage, took a deep breath, and hit send. The email she sent wasn't to human resources. It wasn't to the regional manager. It was to the top, the very top. It was addressed to Mr. Williams, the CEO of the company. Mr. Williams was a man known for his sharp business acumen and strategic brilliance. But what set him apart was his deep sense of empathy. Unlike many corporate leaders, he made it a point to stay connected with his employees, to know their struggles and triumphs. So when the email from a distraught employee landed in his inbox, he didn't dismiss it. He read every word. Sarah's email wasn't long, but it was powerful. She described John's years of dedication, his perfect attendance record, his willingness to go above and beyond for the company. She painted a picture of a man who had become a pillar of support for everyone around him, a man who had been destroyed by a heartless decision for something that any reasonable person would have understood. But what struck Mr. Williams the most was the personal touch. Sarah included a detail that made the entire situation hit home. She mentioned Emma. She wrote about how John often brought her drawings to the office, how he worked long hours just to give his little girl a chance at a better life, and how, despite everything, John never lost his kindness, his humility, or his unwavering dedication. The email ended with a simple plea. Please, Mr. Williams, look into this. John didn't deserve what happened to him, and we need someone like him more than ever. Mr. Williams leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on the screen. He felt a pang in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The world of business could be ruthless, but this was different. This was personal. It reminded him of his own past, of a time when he was just a struggling junior manager, working day and night to support his own family. He remembered the sting of being overlooked, of being treated as disposable by those above him. He'd promised himself back then that if he ever got the chance to make a difference, he would. And now it seemed that chance had come. With a determined glint in his eye, Mr. Williams picked up the phone and made a call to the head of human resources. I need a complete report on a recent dismissal. Name John Matthews. Employee ID 45723, he said curtly. The HR manager hesitated for a split second, then replied, Of course, sir. I'll have it on your desk by the end of the day. No, Mr. Williams interrupted, his tone firm. I want it in an hour. And pull up the files on his supervisor, Mr. Carter. I want to know everything about him, past performance reviews, complaints, every detail. As he hung up, a sense of urgency filled the room. The CEO wasn't a man to be taken lightly when he set his mind on something. And this time, it was personal. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Emails flew back and forth, documents were pulled, and the HR department scrambled to compile every piece of information they had on John and Mr. Carter. By the time the report landed on Mr. Williams' desk, it was thick and filled with details that painted a very different picture from the one Mr. Carter had presented. Mr. Williams skimmed through John's file first. His performance reviews were glowing. Words like irreplaceable, exceptional team player, and consistently exceeds expectations jumped out at him. There were notes about his willingness to mentor new hires, his positive influence on the team, and even a few handwritten comments from previous managers praising his work ethic. But then he flipped to the most recent page, the one written by Mr. Carter. Unreliable, lacks commitment, displays a disregard for company policies. The words were harsh, almost vindictive. It was as if Mr. Carter had been looking for a reason, any reason, to discredit John. And when the opportunity arose, he'd pounced. Mr. Williams' jaw tightened as he turned to Mr. Carter's file. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. There were complaints, more than a few in fact, complaints from employees about his authoritarian style, his tendency to belittle those beneath him, and a string of quiet resignations that seemed to follow wherever he went. And then there was the final piece, a report from the last branch Mr. Carter managed, a report Mr. Williams hadn't seen until now. It detailed a toxic environment, high turnover, and a culture of fear. It was clear that Mr. Carter didn't lead, he ruled, and those who didn't fall in line were either driven out or broken. The CEO's eyes narrowed as he set the file down. This wasn't just a matter of one bad decision. This was a man who had no place in a company that prided itself on its people. He picked up the phone again, his voice calm but cold. "Get Mr. Carter in my office, now." Minutes later, Mr. Carter strode into the CEO's office, his usual arrogance replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected to be called up by the CEO himself, but as soon as he saw the stack of files on Mr. Williams's desk, his unease grew. "Sir, Sit," Mr. Williams commanded, not giving him a chance to speak. Mr. Carter obeyed, his back stiff and his eyes darting nervously to the files. "I've been reviewing your decisions, Mr. Carter, and frankly, I'm concerned." Mr. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Williams raised a hand, silencing him. "You fired an employee with a spotless record, a man who had given 10 years of his life to this company, for being late once. And you did so without any consideration for the circumstances." "He was late," Mr. Carter began defensively, but Mr. Williams' gaze turned icy. "Because he was taking care of his sick daughter," he finished sharply, "a fact you conveniently chose to ignore." Mr. Carter swallowed, the color draining from his face. I was just following protocol." "No," Mr. Williams cut him off, his voice like steel. "You were using protocol as an excuse to abuse your power, and this isn't the first time." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Mr. Carter's. "I will not tolerate managers who think they can destroy lives to make a point. Effective immediately, you are dismissed." Mr. Carter's eyes widened, shock and fear flickering across his face. "Dismissed?" he choked out. "But you can't." "I can," Mr. Williams said coldly, "and I just did." With that, he stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Mr. Carter stumbled out, his face pale and his steps unsteady. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, his gaze shifting back to the file on John. He knew what he had to do. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a start. "Get me John Matthews' contact information," he said softly to his assistant. "I want to speak to him personally, because no man should be punished for putting his family first." And it was time to make things right. The sun was beginning to set when John's phone rang. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his gaze distant as he absently stirred a cup of cold coffee. The days since his dismissal had blurred together into a relentless cycle of job applications, rejection emails, and the gnawing anxiety that came with dwindling savings. He glanced at the caller ID, expecting another impersonal automated message or a bill collector. But the name on the screen made him sit up straighter. Williams Corporation, it read. His heart skipped a beat. Why would they be calling him now? Was it a mistake? A cruel joke? Hands trembling, he answered the call. "Hello? Is this John Matthews?" A calm, authoritative voice asked on the other end. "Yes, this is John," he replied cautiously. "This is Mr. Williams, CEO of Williams Corporation. I believe we need to talk." John's breath caught in his throat. The CEO? Why would someone as powerful as Mr. Williams call him? His mind raced, searching for an explanation. But before he could respond, Mr. Williams continued. "I've been made aware of your recent dismissal," Mr. Williams said, his tone even but laced with a gravity that commanded attention. "And I want you to know that what happened was completely unacceptable. I'm calling to personally apologize on behalf of the company." John blinked, stunned into silence. An apology? From the CEO himself? Mr. Matthews, Mr. Williams went on, his voice softening, I've reviewed your entire record. Your dedication, your impeccable performance, and the way you've positively impacted everyone around you. It's clear to me that your value goes far beyond what's written on paper. What happened to you wasn't just a mistake. It was a grave injustice. John swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him, but he couldn't find the words. All he could manage was a whispered, "Thank you, sir." "You don't need to thank me," Mr. Williams said firmly. "I want to make this right. If you're willing, I'd like to reinstate you." With a promotion, John's heart stuttered, shock coursing through him like an electric current. A promotion? Was he hearing this correctly? I I don't understand, he stammered. After everything, why would you want me back? Because we need more people like you, Mr. Williams replied without hesitation. People who put others first, who are loyal and hardworking, who don't break under pressure. I know you've been through a lot, John, and you have every right to walk away. But if you're willing to give us another chance, I'd be honored to have you on the team again. And this time, in a position that reflects your true worth. Tears burned at the corners of John's eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to keep his composure. He thought about Emma, about all the sleepless nights worrying about their future, about the crushing weight of feeling like a failure. And now, out of nowhere, this lifeline, a second chance. Sir, He cleared his throat, struggling to keep his voice steady. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now, Mr. Williams said gently. Just think about it. Take your time, and when you're ready, we'll be here. The call ended, leaving John staring at his phone in disbelief. Was this real? Could this really be happening? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. Daddy, who was that? John turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her head tilted in curiosity. He took a deep breath, a genuine smile breaking through the storm of emotions inside him. It was someone very important, he murmured, crouching down to her level. And guess what? Daddy might be getting his job back. Emma's eyes widened, a delighted gasp escaping her lips. Really? That's amazing. John chuckled, pulling her into a tight hug. Yes, sweetheart, it really is. The days that followed were filled with cautious hope. John still couldn't quite believe it, couldn't shake the fear that it would all fall apart. But as he met with Mr. Williams in person and saw the sincerity in his eyes, the fear began to fade. The CEO wasn't just offering John his old job back. He was offering him a fresh start, a chance to be more than just an employee, a chance to lead, to mentor, to make a real difference. John accepted the offer, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. But there was one more thing Mr. Williams wanted to address. Mr. Carter, he said, his gaze steady as he met John's eyes across the polished mahogany desk. He's been terminated, effective immediately. His behavior was not only unprofessional, it went against everything we stand for as a company. I want you to know that we don't tolerate people like him. John nodded slowly, a strange sense of closure settling over him. He hadn't sought revenge. He wasn't that kind of person. But knowing that Mr. Carter wouldn't be able to mistreat anyone else brought a sense of peace. Thank you, sir, John said quietly, for everything. Mr. Williams smiled, standing and extending his hand. No, John, thank you, for reminding us what truly matters. Word of John's reinstatement spread through the company like wildfire. The office, once tense and fearful, buzzed with excitement. People whispered in the hallways, exchanged knowing glances, and slowly, hope returned. Because if John could come back from what happened, if he could be rewarded for his integrity and dedication, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope for everyone. When John walked through those office doors again, it wasn't as the same man who had left in shame and defeat. He held his head high, his shoulders straight, every step radiating quiet strength. His colleagues gathered around him, offering congratulations, shaking his hand, and some even wiping away tears. It was more than just a welcome back. It was a recognition of who he was and what he stood for. John, it's so good to have you back, Sarah said softly, her eyes bright with emotion. We were all rooting for you. John smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. Thank you, Sarah. I... He paused, struggling to find the right words. I couldn't have done it without you. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. You deserve this, John. Every bit of it. But the biggest surprise came later that afternoon. As John was settling into his new office, a spacious, sunlit room with a view of the city, there was a knock at the door. Daddy! He turned, his heart leaping at the sight of Emma standing there. Her face lit up with a smile, and standing beside her was Mr. Williams, his expression gentle. I thought Emma might want to see where her dad is working now, the CEO said with a grin. John's breath caught in his throat as he looked around the office. His office. It felt surreal. Just a few days ago, he had been lost, broken, terrified for their future. And now? Do you like it, sweetheart? He asked softly, kneeling beside Emma. She nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with wonder. It's so big. You have your own desk, and look, a window. John laughed, the sound light and free. He glanced up at Mr. Williams, gratitude and respect shining in his eyes. Thank you, sir, for everything. Mr. Williams nodded, his gaze warm. You earned it, John. You're a good man, and this company is lucky to have you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, John stood by the window, his arm wrapped around Emma's shoulders. He took a deep breath, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Life had knocked him down. It had broken him, tested him, pushed him to the brink. But he hadn't given up. He'd kept fighting, kept believing, kept hoping. And now, as he looked out over the city, his daughter's small hand clasped in his, John knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments, when it feels like everything is falling apart, the pieces are just rearranging themselves for something greater. Something like redemption, and he would never take that for granted again. If this story moved you and reminded you of the importance of kindness and resilience, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need to hear this today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.